This is not just another courtroom story. What you're about to hear is a true event that rocked an entire nation and shattered public trust in the justice system. In a packed courtroom, filled with lawyers, judges, and officers of the law, a 3-year-old boy named Jacob did the unthinkable. In the middle of a tense legal proceeding, he dropped his toy fire truck, stood up, and pointed directly at a police officer. With 2 simple words, "It's him," he stopped the entire room cold. No one could have predicted that this innocent child's spontaneous gesture would unravel one of the largest police corruption rings in modern history. What happened next would change lives, rewrite laws, and expose just how deep the rot had spread. It was a day like any other inside the courtroom, formal, composed, and filled with the quiet hum of legal procedure. The judge shuffled notes at the bench, attorneys whispered strategies, and uniformed officers stood like statues along the walls. Among the many faces in the crowd sat a young mother, Emily, holding her 3-year-old son, Jacob, on her lap. She was there to give her testimony in an armed robbery case, just another witness doing her civic duty. Jacob, far too young to grasp the seriousness of his surroundings, had been allowed to sit quietly with her after no babysitter could be found. He clutched his favorite red toy fire truck in both hands, running it up and down the armrest of the wooden bench, making soft motor sounds under his breath. But then something shifted. As the side doors opened and a line of police officers walked in to take their positions, Jacob suddenly froze. His tiny hands stopped moving. The fire truck slipped from his fingers and hit the courtroom floor with a loud clack, the sound cutting through the murmuring room like a gunshot. He didn't flinch. His wide, innocent eyes had locked onto something, or someone. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand and pointed at one of the officers near the back of the room. "There," he said, his voice clear, unshaken. "It's him." Time stood still. Emily blinked, unsure of what she had just heard. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The officer Jacob pointed to, Sergeant Michael Sanders, visibly paled. His rigid posture faltered. His eyes darted from side to side, and one hand instinctively moved to his belt. For a moment, the courtroom was silent, no papers rustling, no footsteps, no coughs. Just a growing tension, thick as smoke. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. "Jacob, sweetheart," she whispered, trying to pull his hand down, flustered by the attention. But he wouldn't move. His finger stayed fixed. His eyes remained locked. "Mama," he said again, more firmly now. "That's him. From the store." The judge leaned forward, his brow furrowing. The prosecutor stopped mid-sentence. And the officer, now visibly trembling, took an unconscious step backward, as if cornered by something far greater than the gaze of a child. That was the moment everything changed. The room hung in an eerie stillness, the kind that follows a lightning strike before the thunder crashes. A 3-year-old's voice should not carry such weight, but Jacob's words had frozen the breath of every soul in that courtroom. His tiny finger, still pointed with unwavering resolve, seemed to slice through the air. Emily felt as though her heart had stopped. Her arms instinctively tightened around Jacob, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and dread. 1,000 thoughts flashed through her mind, but none formed fully. What had he just said? Why was everyone staring? The man at the center of the storm, Sergeant Michael Sanders, stood motionless. A seasoned officer, known for his discipline and calm, was now visibly unraveling. His jaw clenched. A subtle twitch ran down the corner of his left eye. His chest rose and fell faster than before. And then Emily saw it, a tremor in his right hand, faint, but there. He was afraid. The prosecutor, Jonathan Reyes, who had seen hardened criminals and corrupt officials through decades of courtroom battles, sensed it instantly. It wasn't just surprise in Sanders' expression, it was recognition. Guilt. The kind that couldn't be faked or mistaken. Rhea's instincts, honed by years of reading faces, knew they were looking at the beginning of something far more sinister than anyone had anticipated. He rose from his chair slowly, not wanting to draw attention to himself just yet. His eyes flicked from Jacob to Sanders, then to the judge. "Your Honor," he said evenly, though his voice carried an undertone of urgency, "I respectfully request a recess. Something needs to be addressed." Judge Wallace narrowed his eyes, reading the room. He could feel it too, the tension, the unease, the sharp sting of something unspoken but deeply wrong. He nodded once. "Court will recess for 10 minutes, he said. Then, after a pause that sent a quiet ripple through the room, he added, "Sergeant Sanders, remain where you are." The command, though polite, rang with unmistakable authority. But Sanders didn't respond. Instead, his eyes darted toward the double doors at the rear of the courtroom. His shoulders tensed. His stance shifted. And then he moved. Just one step. But it was enough. A murmur swept through the benches. A bailiff near the exit straightened, one hand resting on the baton clipped to his belt. "Sergeant," he began, but the warning was already in the air. "Don't," Judge Wallace said, this time sharply, a note of steel in his voice. All eyes locked on Sanders. He stopped mid-step, and for a moment, his composure returned, but only barely. He raised his hands slowly, palms outward, and forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice hoarse. "This is a misunderstanding." But it wasn't. Not to Jacob, whose gaze never faltered. Not to Emily, whose hands trembled now as she held her son. Not to Reyes, who had seen too many liars break under pressure to mistake what was happening in front of him. The prosecutor crossed the floor and knelt beside Emily, his voice low and gentle. "Has your son ever seen that man before today?" he asked. Emily blinked, still in shock, and shook her head. "No. Never. I would remember." Reyes nodded. "And the robbers? The ones you saw that day, did you see their faces?" "No, they wore masks," she said quietly, but one of them, her words slowed, realization dawning like cold water splashed on her face. One of them limped. The room seemed to inhale sharply all at once. Reyes stood slowly. His eyes moved to Sanders, who now looked like a man caught in a collapsing house, cornered by walls of truth that he could no longer hold up. The prosecutor gave a subtle nod to the bailiffs. Two of them moved toward the officer, not running, but with measured, certain steps. The truth was no longer hiding. And it all started with the courage of a child who saw what the adults could not, or would not, see. The judge's chambers, normally a place of quiet deliberation and administrative order, now felt like the eye of a coming storm. The heavy oak door closed behind them with a thud that seemed to echo longer than it should have, as though time itself had grown hesitant. Judge Wallace took his seat behind the large, dark desk, while Prosecutor Jonathan Reyes remained standing, arms folded tightly across his chest, eyes locked on the man sitting across from them. Sergeant Michael Sanders sat rigidly, the straight-backed wooden chair creaking faintly under his tense frame. His eyes flicked briefly around the room, toward the thick curtains drawn across the windows, the dusty books lining the shelves, the painting of Lady Justice above the judge's head, anywhere but toward the people scrutinizing him. He tried to appear composed, but his body betrayed him. His left leg, the one with the barely concealed limp, twitched involuntarily. His hands, clasped tightly on his lap, had begun to sweat. The cold professionalism he always wore like a uniform was starting to crack. The silence dragged on, heavy, intentional, pressing down on him like a weight. Then Judge Wallace broke it. "Sergeant Sanders," he said in a voice like gravel underfoot. "What happened out there just now was not ordinary. A 3-year-old child looked directly at you, out of dozens of strangers in uniform, and declared, without hesitation, that you were there during a violent robbery. That alone might have been dismissed as coincidence or confusion, if not for the limp." The judge's tone sharpened on those last 3 words. It was a deliberate knife. Sanders didn't respond. His lips parted slightly, then closed. His chest rose and fell in shallow, careful breaths. Still trying to keep control, Reyes stepped forward slowly. His voice was calm, but razor-sharp. "You were the lead officer on the robbery case that brought Emily Wilson here to testify today. But this isn't about one robbery anymore. Your reaction in court, your silence now, it all tells us more than you realize." Sanders finally looked up, his eyes dark and flat. "You're interrogating me based on a child's outburst?" Reyes didn't blink. "No. We're interrogating you because you looked terrified." A flicker of something passed over Sanders' face, denial, anger, or maybe just the realization that he was losing ground. "We've reopened every case you've worked on for the past 5 years, Reyes continued. "And we're starting to see patterns. Details that didn't make sense before. Victims who described a suspect with a limp. And who was always the first to respond? You." Sanders' hands began to move nervously, fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. The mask was slipping, even if he hadn't noticed. Outside the chamber, in a separate witness room, Emily sat in stunned silence, clutching Jacob tightly against her chest. He had grown quiet, worn out from the overwhelming courtroom scene, his small fingers still curled around the little toy fire truck he'd brought in. Emily's mind, however, was spiraling. She could still hear his voice, high and certain, "Mama, it's him." It played again and again in her memory, slicing through her like a cold wind. The confidence in his voice. The fear in the officer's eyes. The limp. It couldn't be, but it was. Her mind tried to reject the truth, but something inside her already knew. Her stomach twisted with a sick mix of dread and guilt. She had wanted to shield her son from the darkness of the world, but instead, he had dragged it into the light with a single, innocent gesture. A quiet knock startled her. The door opened and Reyes stepped inside, his face pale but focused. "Ms. Wilson," he said gently, "we're going to place you and your son under protective custody. Effective immediately." She looked up at him, blinking. "Why? What's happening?" Reyes hesitated for only a moment. "Because I believe Sergeant Sanders is part of something much larger. And if that's true, then everything we thought we knew is about to collapse." Back in the judge's chambers, the tension had reached its breaking point. Sanders sat slumped forward now, hands shaking. Judge Wallace and Reyes watched in silence, letting the weight of the moment press him into submission. "You can keep quiet and watch it all fall down around you," the judge said, voice low. "Or you can start talking." There was a long pause. Then Sanders inhaled sharply, as though coming up from underwater. His eyes glistened. And finally, slowly, hoarsely, he spoke. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he muttered. "The first time, it was supposed to be one time." Reyes leaned in. "How long has it been going on?" Sanders closed his eyes. 7 years, he whispered. "We picked easy targets. People who wouldn't fight back. Old shopkeepers. Immigrants. The poor. We used inside info. Security schedules. Alarm systems. Then I'd be the first on scene and make sure the evidence went cold." His voice broke on the last word. Reyes exchanged a grim look with the judge. The dam had broken, and the flood of truth was just beginning. The truth had broken through like a lightning bolt, shattering the dark, sudden, raw, and impossible to ignore. Sergeant Sanders' confession was only the beginning. It didn't end with one crooked officer. It unveiled a web of betrayal far more intricate and sinister than anyone had dared imagine. The revelation sent shockwaves through the prosecutor's office, shaking even the most seasoned investigators. Prosecutor Daniel Reyes stood still for a long moment after hearing the full tape of Sanders' confession. He felt a hollow weight settle in his chest, the kind of cold that doesn't come from weather, but from knowing you've trusted the wrong people for far too long. His jaw clenched as he turned toward the window of his office, his reflection barely visible against the city lights. How many innocent people had been thrown behind bars because of lies hidden behind badges? Down the hall, Detective Clara Monroe, handpicked to lead the internal investigation, flipped through case files with a grim intensity. Her eyes were bloodshot from sleepless nights. Her fingers, usually so steady, trembled slightly as she highlighted names and circled dates. She had spent her entire career believing in justice, in the system. Now, each document she touched felt like a betrayal. Each photograph of a wrongly convicted victim was a punch to her gut. One file, in particular, froze her hand mid-page. It was a robbery report from 3 years ago. The victim was a young single mother who had been held at gunpoint while her toddler screamed beside her. The report had described one of the assailants limping heavily on his right leg. At the time, no one had made the connection. But now, with Sanders' confession echoing in her ears, Clara knew it had been him. Again. She slammed the file shut and stood abruptly. "We've got a pattern," she said to her team, her voice sharp, her frustration boiling over. "We missed it for years, but it's there, and it's been hiding in plain sight." Meanwhile, across the city, in a safe house tucked behind layers of surveillance and armed security, Carolina, known to the public as Emily, sat silently on a couch, her arms wrapped protectively around Gabriel. He had fallen asleep against her side, his small fingers still curled around a toy truck. His breathing was soft and even, unaware of the chaos unfolding because of his innocent gesture. Carolina stared at him, her heart swelling with love and fear in equal measure. She traced her fingers through his hair, then looked at the dark window across the room, her reflection flickering in the glass. Guilt gnawed at her insides. She had seen the limp. She remembered it vividly from the night of the robbery. But she dismissed it, too afraid to accuse a man in uniform, too scared to trust her own instincts. That fear, that hesitation, had almost cost them everything. The knock on the door jolted her from her thoughts. Detective Monroe stepped inside, holding a secure tablet. "Emily," she said gently, keeping her voice low so as not to wake Gabriel. "You need to see this." She placed the tablet on the coffee table and pressed play. The video that began was from an interrogation room. Sanders, hunched over, his hands twitching nervously, eyes sunken. "I didn't act alone," he muttered on the recording, barely above a whisper. "You think I could have done this without help?" The captain signed off on the fake reports. The judge cleared the warrants. "We all had a piece of the pie. And we framed the ones who couldn't fight back." Carolina covered her mouth with her hand, stifling a cry. Tears welled in her eyes, not just from horror, but from rage. These were the people who were supposed to protect them. And instead, they had built a criminal empire on fear, lies, and blood. Back at headquarters, red string crisscrossed a massive corkboard, connecting photographs of suspects, victims, bank records, and locations. The deeper the team dug, the darker the story became. Offshore accounts, shell companies, property deeds and false names. Every piece pointed to one chilling truth: this had been going on for years, and no one had dared to stop it. Until now. Reyes stood in front of the board, his voice low but determined. "We protect that boy at all costs. If Sanders cracks, others will fall." But Gabriel's finger, that moment in court, it exposed the rot. "He's the reason we have a chance to cleanse this system." Outside, rain began to fall, tapping softly against the windows like a warning. Somewhere in the shadows of the city, the people Sanders named would soon know they were exposed, and desperate men with power never fall quietly. But in that small room, with her son safe in her arms, Carolina whispered to herself, voice trembling but resolute, "We won't run anymore." They wore the badge to commit crimes. Gabriel wore nothing but truth. The storm had arrived. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that pressed against the skin like humidity before a storm. Rows of people sat shoulder to shoulder, barely moving, barely breathing. Even the judge's gavel had been silent for some time now. This wasn't just another trial. This was the moment the entire country had been waiting for, the reckoning of a man who had once worn the uniform of honor but had secretly wielded it as a weapon of corruption. Sergeant Thomas Sanders entered the room in handcuffs. Gone was the crisp uniform and polished boots. In their place were a drab prison-issued outfit and the slump of a man whose lies had unraveled. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, yet darting, still searching for an escape that no longer existed. In the front row sat Carolina, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, fingernails leaving half-moon marks in her palms. Every time her gaze drifted to Sanders, she felt a mix of rage, fear, and disbelief. Could this really be the same man who had once stood as a symbol of protection, who had responded to her robbery with apparent concern, only to be the one behind it? Beside her sat Gabriel, now 4 years old. His little legs swung back and forth under the wooden bench. Dressed in a neat, small suit, he looked solemn, far beyond his years. His presence had been debated fiercely by attorneys and court officials, but ultimately, the symbolic weight of his role was too great to ignore. He was the boy who had pointed without hesitation. The one who saw what no one else dared to see. As Sanders was seated, Gabriel's body tensed. He leaned into his mother's side, eyes fixed on the man who had triggered a nation's awakening. Carolina felt her son tremble slightly and wrapped her arm around him, grounding him. She whispered softly, "You're safe. I promise." The prosecutor, Daniel Reyes, rose from his seat with deliberate calm. "Your Honor, members of the court," he began, his voice carrying conviction, "this case is not simply about one man's crimes. It's about a system manipulated from within. And it all began with the courage of a child." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Reyes turned toward the jury, his expression solemn. Sergeant Sanders used his badge to disguise a long-running scheme of violence, theft, and betrayal. He manipulated the system, preyed on vulnerable citizens, and orchestrated false investigations to cover his tracks. The details are horrifying, but the truth, thanks to a child's instinct, is finally within reach. One by one, the prosecutor laid out the evidence. Financial records, damning audio recordings, testimony from victims and fellow officers. Each piece of evidence was a nail in the coffin of Sanders' carefully constructed lies. Carolina was called to the stand. She walked with measured steps, her posture upright but her hands trembling slightly. She took a deep breath before speaking. "I was brought here to testify about a robbery. I didn't expect my son to say anything. He was just a little boy, but when he saw Sanders walk into that room, everything changed. He dropped his toy, and he pointed. Not out of confusion, not for attention, but because he recognized something." She turned to face the judge. "That limp, I remembered it too. But I dismissed it. Because we trust the badge. We're taught to trust authority. My son reminded me that truth doesn't wear a uniform. It speaks through feeling. Tears welled in Carolina's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Her voice grew stronger. Gabriel gave us that moment. That single, undeniable truth. And from that moment on, the truth unraveled everything. Then came the tapes. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as Sanders' own voice played through the speakers. The tone was flat, almost mechanical. We knew who had money. Who was alone. We chose the elderly, the shop owners, the single mothers. I'd be first on the scene. I'd steer the case. Sometimes we planted evidence. Sometimes we didn't need to. Nobody questioned us. We were the law. Gasps. A woman in the back began to cry. Another man shook his head in disbelief. Sanders kept his head low, hands clasped, jaw clenched as though holding back a scream. When Gabriel was asked to identify Sanders again, he simply nodded. No hesitation. No confusion. Just quiet certainty. That's him, he whispered. The courtroom broke. Some cried. Some clapped. Others shouted out in fury or grief. But what everyone shared in that moment was an overwhelming sense of release, like truth had finally been allowed to breathe after years of suffocation. Outside, thousands had gathered in the streets. Television screens displayed the proceedings in real time. Protesters waved signs reading, "Justice for the silenced" and "The Gabriel Protocol saves lives." Around the country, reform laws were already being drafted, influenced directly by what was unfolding in this courtroom. As the judge called for adjournment, Carolina held Gabriel close. Her heart, though still heavy with the knowledge of what they'd endured, beat with hope for the first time in years. "You did something incredible, my love," she whispered into his hair. And the world saw it. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. His small hand found hers and squeezed. Months had passed since the courtroom erupted with the truth, yet its echoes still reverberated across Brazil and far beyond. What began with the simple, instinctive gesture of a child had evolved into a sweeping national reckoning. Reform wasn't just an idea anymore. It was happening. The newly formed Gabriel Protocol, named in honor of the young boy whose innocent eyes saw through a lifetime of deception, had been signed into law. It mandated body cameras for all law enforcement operations, independent civilian oversight boards in every precinct, and the integration of AI analysis to monitor for patterns of corruption and abuse. In the heart of São Paulo, a towering glass building stood newly opened, the Gabriel Center for Justice Reform. Its reflective surface shimmered in the sunlight, and engraved in polished steel at the front were the words, "Truth can come from the purest sources." Inside the building, Carolina stood nervously in a waiting room, clutching Gabriel's hand as they prepared for their next speech. She had been invited to speak at a United Nations summit on child psychology and justice reform. At first, she had hesitated. She was no public speaker, no politician. Just a mother who'd once been too scared to trust her own instincts. But the world had seen something in her story, something raw and human. Something they needed. Gabriel, now 4, sat quietly by her side in a miniature chair, coloring in a picture of a firefighter. He still didn't fully understand the impact of what he had done. Sometimes Carolina wondered if it was better that way. The world had placed the weight of change on such small shoulders, but she was determined to let him remain a child for as long as possible. As they were called in, Carolina took one final deep breath, straightened her blazer, and guided Gabriel into the spotlight. The auditorium was packed. World leaders, scholars, journalists, and activists filled the room. Carolina stepped up to the podium as images of the trial flashed behind her, screens showing grainy footage of Sanders' confession, of Gabriel pointing his tiny finger in the courtroom, and of tearful victims being reunited with their families. "I never expected," she began slowly, her voice catching, "that walking into a courtroom to testify would change the direction of our lives, or the lives of thousands of others." She paused, eyes scanning the room. "When my son pointed to a man in uniform and said, 'That's him,' I was terrified. I thought he was wrong. I thought I was imagining things. But what I've learned since that day is that children, without the filters of fear, bias, or conditioning, can see what we sometimes refuse to." A hush fell over the audience. Gabriel didn't bring down a crime ring because he's special in ways other children aren't. He did it because he trusted what he felt. Because he wasn't afraid to speak the truth. And because, miraculously, someone finally listened. She turned to look at her son, who smiled, blissfully unaware that history was being written around him. "What we do now with that truth matters more than ever," she continued. "The Gabriel Protocol isn't just a set of laws. It's a mirror held up to our society, asking us whether we value safety over silence, and truth over tradition. I hope we choose courage." The applause came like a wave, first hesitant, then rising into a storm of approval. Outside the conference, journalists from Japan, Germany, South Africa, and Canada crowded for interviews. Activists from marginalized communities handed her letters, thanking her for giving them hope that accountability was possible. One woman sobbed as she embraced Carolina, whispering, "My son was wrongly imprisoned. But now, because of Gabriel, we have a chance to fight again." Even law enforcement officials began to adopt change. Cities in Colombia and Chile sent delegations to learn about Brazil's oversight systems. European policymakers pushed for their own versions of the Gabriel Protocol. In classrooms and police academies, the case became a standard module, proof that a society's integrity could be restored, not by brute force, but by truth bravely spoken. And back at home, Gabriel's life slowly returned to a quiet rhythm. He returned to preschool, traded courtrooms for playgrounds, and sometimes drew pictures of people holding hands under bright yellow suns. Carolina watched him often, wondering how something so monumental could come from someone so small. But that was the lesson, wasn't it? That truth, real, earth-shaking truth, didn't need power or privilege. Sometimes, it just needed a finger pointed at the right moment. And someone brave enough to believe it. The story of Gabriel, the boy who pointed, had traveled far beyond Brazil's borders. His image, captured in a single, electrifying moment inside that courtroom, now hung in newsrooms, government buildings, and classrooms around the world. With his small hand raised and eyes wide in childlike certainty, Gabriel had become a symbol of uncompromising honesty. In South Africa, a group of young law students at the University of Cape Town held a silent vigil, candles in hand, as they read aloud the translated transcript of Carolina's courtroom testimony. "We don't just study justice," one student said into a microphone, her voice quivering, "we must feel it, like that child did. Without fear, without filter." In the Philippines, a whistleblower in the Manila Police Department cited Gabriel's courage as the reason he finally came forward with evidence of tampered crime scene reports. "If a child can speak the truth," he said on a live news broadcast, "so can we." Delegations from Sweden, Canada, and Kenya arrived in Sao Paulo over the following months, eager to learn how Brazil had transformed its broken justice system. Each wanted to implement their own version of the Gabriel Protocol, rules that insisted on accountability, oversight, and above all, human dignity. Back in Brazil, Carolina had become something she never expected, a national voice. Her speeches weren't grand or political, they were quiet, personal, filled with the kind of honesty that disarmed even the most skeptical. She spoke not as a hero, but as a mother. As someone who, for a fleeting moment, had doubted her own child, and now carried the guilt and gratitude of listening just in time. On a gray morning in Brasilia, Carolina stood on a wide marble platform overlooking the city. Below her stretched a plaza newly renamed Praça da Verdade, the Square of Truth. The dedication ceremony was about to begin. Behind her stood a bronze statue of Gabriel, not large, not towering like those of generals or presidents, but life-sized, standing just over 3 feet tall, finger raised, gaze fixed on something far in the distance. Carolina's hands trembled as she stepped to the microphone. Not from fear, but from the weight of what had happened. "I once thought I was just a witness," she began. A woman standing behind glass, seeing a crime she could barely understand. "I never imagined the real witness that day would be my son." Or that his voice, so small, so pure, would echo loud enough to break open a nation's silence. She paused, her voice tightening. Justice is not found in robes or titles. It begins in the eyes of someone unafraid to say, "That's wrong. That's him." Tears rolled freely down many faces in the crowd. Gabriel reminded us of something we have forgotten. That truth doesn't always wear a uniform. That sometimes, the smallest voices are the ones we need to hear the most. The wind stirred the flags behind her. A child's laughter echoed nearby. It was Gabriel, now playing in a corner with other children, still blissfully unaware of what his gesture had done. That afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, lighting up the plaza in golden hues, news outlets around the globe carried the same headline. From Sao Paulo to the world, justice, through the eyes of a child. And somewhere, in some distant courtroom or crowded police precinct, another person, perhaps a parent, a witness, a young officer, found the courage to speak up. Because of Gabriel. Because of truth. Because one child pointed. Years passed. The story of little Gabriel became part of textbooks, documentaries, and the very DNA of a transformed justice system. Children in schools were now taught the value of honesty not as a rule, but as a legacy. Teachers would show the image of a boy with a raised finger and ask, "What does truth look like to you?" Gabriel, now 9 years old, lived a quiet life in a small coastal town with Carolina. Though the world saw him as a symbol, to his mother he remained just her son, the boy who still loved fire trucks, who scraped his knees chasing waves, who asked impossible questions at bedtime. He never boasted of what he'd done. In fact, he rarely spoke of that day in the courtroom. It was as if, deep down, some part of him still didn't understand the weight of his own action. And maybe that was for the best. Maybe the truest heroes are the ones who don't know they're heroes at all. One morning, a young journalist visited their home. She had grown up hearing the story of the Gabriel Protocol, and now, with her camera in hand and a notebook full of questions, she wanted to meet the boy who changed Brazil. "Do you remember what you felt that day?" she asked gently, crouching beside him in the garden. Gabriel tilted his head, brushing a petal from his knee. "I just knew he was bad," he said with a shrug. "I felt it here." He pointed to his chest. The journalist smiled. "Would you do it again?" Gabriel looked up, his face more serious now. "Yes. Even if no one believed me." Carolina, watching from the porch, felt her eyes sting with pride. In that moment, she saw not just her son, but a truth that had echoed across the world, simple, incorruptible, and fierce. The journalist closed her notebook. "Thank you, Gabriel. For everything." Later that night, as the stars glimmered above their small home, Carolina whispered to her son as he drifted to sleep, "You didn't just change the world, Gabriel. You reminded it who it could be." And somewhere, in a courtroom far away, a child sat beside their parent, watching silently, watching the uniforms, the grown-up faces, the ticking clock on the wall. And if a moment came, if truth needed a voice again, that child might raise a finger too. Because truth never dies. It waits. And sometimes, it speaks through the smallest hands. One tiny voice. One brave finger pointing through the lies. That's all it took to bring down a powerful network hiding behind the mask of justice. Jacob, just 3 years old, unknowingly ignited a revolution within the legal system. His innocence became a beacon of truth in a world clouded by deception and fear. Thanks to him, the Gabriel Protocol was born, a new standard of transparency, integrity, and accountability. And while Jacob returns to his toys and playgrounds, blissfully unaware of the storm he calmed with a single act, the nation remembers. His photograph, frozen in that moment of truth, now hangs in courtrooms as a reminder, justice can come from the purest places. Let his story be shared, because sometimes, the smallest people make the biggest difference.